Welcome to this discussion on consent. I'm Alex Gerhardt.
I'm Michaela Dantzler.
I'm Jalen Schumacher.
And I'm Shay Pham.
And we're here to talk about what consent looks like in society and what we've been missing or what misconceptions that we've had in the last few decades as well as in our society in general. A big problem that we've been noticing is that there's a lack of education on a lot of aspects of consent in public schooling, especially in terms of what the governmental systems and states have recommended for different public schools. What does education look like in schools in terms of consent?
Yeah, so we take schools to kind of be the first place that we get introduced to a lot of topics, and one of those is sex education. However, it varies across states by a large margin.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we only have 22 states that require a sex education course, and it still has a lot of variability within that itself. Many of those are not comprehensive, and for the state of Georgia in particular, we know that it's not comprehensive and also does not have to be medically accurate, which is very highly concerning.
A little bit questionable,
definitely.
Not exactly ideal for in terms of education-wise.
For sure, and definitely as far as topics that they're going over in sex education, consent may or may not even be on that list.
Yeah, it's just sex ed
Yes.
baseline, no exceptions.
Especially when we have an abstinence push for
That's the only option,
sex education, and that being the only option, like you said, that definitely takes consent out of it if we're all being told just don't do it in general.
Yeah.
So that's a very large problem. But consent is something that we should always talk about openly, and talk about it clearly as well. We need the language to talk about it. Definitely as
when it becomes like taboo, it's just that nobody talks about it.
Exactly.
And therefore, it's just kind of like an unspoken, well, don't talk about it, don't say anything about it, and it'll just figure it out itself.
A lot of people find it kind of awkward to discuss consent, so they might just gloss over it entirely.
Especially since if it's not taught in schools, then parents are expected to teach it. And if they're uncomfortable talking about that with like their preteen or teenager, then they don't ever get the exposure or the experience or the knowledge that, is probably really necessary in society. So, I think that's only 22 states, and then, like you said, it varies by state.
Exactly. So it's like we have a lack of talking about it both in education and socially, so that can be quite dangerous.
Yeah.
Especially for children, and a lot of times people think like, how does the child's world, work with consent? Well, it's like when we get down to it, consent is about bodily autonomy, and that's something that you can teach at any age.
Yeah.
And when you're a child, it's teaching them that, hey, this is your body, you are the one in control of it, you get to say, what happens to your body, and teaching them when it's okay to talk about certain things and when it's okay to show your body like to an adult, like at a doctor's office, and things like that. So it's a very important topic that needs to talk and be talked about starting from a young age. I know one of the things that I immediately think of talking about consent with children is a lot of children, just socially, parents will tell their child, oh, like, go hug your relatives, and it's something that even them as a young child should have the right to, say, oh, I don't want to hug, other people right now. And having that ability to, say no and know that their body is, of their own choice what to do with it.
Yeah, right. I think there's an excellent point there about, like how if children are not taught what is okay and what's not, and how they can say yes or no to certain, like situations physically, like that brings on the issue of child grooming and that those children might be taken advantage of because they don't know that they have the autonomy to say no. They don't know what's right or wrong or like what's acceptable, and they've never been taught like the guidelines, like that opens them up to being taken advantage of.
Internalizing the idea that sometimes or in some situations that they might have to do things with their body that they don't really want to.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's just the way it is, and I feel like that can come back later if they're in a certain situation and they feel like, oh, I don't really want to do this, but I might not really have a choice. So I feel like that will definitely impact them in that way.
I think that ties a lot into like societal expectations. Like, a lot of people at young ages are exposed to like different types of media that has to do with, sexual encounters, and especially from a young age with the increase of media and internet access for most of the young population, whether they be iPad kids or, they just have access to a family computer. I mean, there's so much less regulation and there's so much more availability of some types of, explicit content. So, I mean, I think you said a good point when we were talking earlier about how different, exposure to different explicit media has really cemented in society about how consent is perceived in terms of explicit media.
Absolutely, because really, as we all know, in this day and age, social media has become such a widespread thing. Most kids have phones by the age of elementary school, and according to research, I mean, most boys or most children in general will start watching pornography as early as middle school, and in many cases, most of what they see is not very accurate. A lot of pornography is a fantasized version of what people think sex is. It's not accurate to what sex is in real life. Consent is often not discussed at all in pornography, and when people watch that kind of thing, and when children are exposed to such topics at such a young age, that's what they think that sex is supposed to look like, and that's what they carry on throughout their lives. And once they actually encounter these situations, that's what they will enact.
Yeah. I mean, I think something like you said, how, consent is almost, I mean, there's very little percentage of any type of explicit media that consent is even expressed, so like most, like if young, children or, teenagers are exposed to this media where they never see consent being expressed, even if they're paid actors and are participating, and there's some disclaimer at the beginning or something, they never see like how consent is actually addressed. Like it just happens. So they never figure out like like we are a species that models our behavior off of things we see and things we view between relationships with their parents or how we're raised or things that we're exposed to. So if young children or young teenagers are only exposed to media where consent is never even mentioned, like how can we expect these people that have sex lives, that's a normal thing that happens in human development, and they go into these situations unprepared basically because they've never really, all they have is what they're modeling themselves after from these, pornographic images, and they've never seen anybody actually request or give consent in sexual scenarios. So
I read an article that the subtle sexual scripts that are present in pornography can really influence how people think about consent. It can kind of build up this cognitive image of that consent is not really necessary, or that communicating about consent is kind of awkward and unnatural. And it can even push people towards the idea that those who are on like the receiving end, they can give their consent by just doing nothing.
That's key.
Absence of a no or
which really becomes problematic when drugs and alcohol are involved.
Like then the situation gets so much more blurred. Yeah. So people are just relying on like, oh well, they're not resisting.
No. Yeah. They're not resisting. Yeah, that's actually, I think that's fundamental in terms of how the media especially portrays like different types of consent. I mean, when you watch TV shows, there's a lot of, they're drunk and they're going to hook up in the bar bathroom, and that's completely fine. And, like, it's consensual, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But when, I think what you said about how somebody's not persisting or not saying no, that is often taken as consent. They're not saying no. Maybe they don't want it to happen, but they're not expressing that they don't want it to happen. Yeah. So therefore, the other party is being like, well, this isn't, they're not telling me no, they're not resisting, so therefore it's okay,
I read that some people like feel like they can't really say no because they're worried about how the other person is going to react.
There's so many societal pressures, like especially in terms of, like, I think college relationships have come up where there's so many expectations, especially as a young adult entering like the adult world of living on your own and living with other young people around in your community, and for it to be it's so normalized for sexual encounters to be brief, and people are expected to put out, and if not, then maybe this guy will go tell his frat brothers that she didn't put out, or she led me on, and I think something that's really important to think about is how there's been statistics that have shown where they've asked people in college, they asked men if they were to be given a situation where if they were to commit sexual assault or rape, and they wouldn't get caught for it, and 35% of male college students admitted that if they didn't get caught for sexual assault or rape, then they would commit it, which I think is something that we can really blame on the culture and just the treatment of victims of sexual assault as well as perpetrators, where they get a slap on the wrist, or they get a warning, or they get even if they get charged, it's a year in jail versus...
And that barely even happens.
Yeah, and 1% of all men, or all perpetrators of sexual assault, actually get...
consequences.
And get prison sentence for their time for committing the crime. So
I think that's a really, really big problem, is the justice system with it.
Yeah.
But also just on the other side of that, realizing how, some people say that, stopping to ask that question kills the vibe or kills the mood. But realizing that the research has shown that
it can
people
make your relationship stronger.
it makes the relationship stronger, and that when
it
there
also
is
makes
consent,
the sex more satisfying.
Yes,
Right.
There's more satisfaction in sex, and that's really...
Those that have more positive attitudes towards consent, and they think affirmative consent is important, it shows that they have higher sexual satisfaction,
and it forms a deeper relationship between the two consenting parties. I mean,
so at the end of the day, everyone is happy.
Yeah.
You don't want sex to be a negative thing. You don't want to have any kind of negative attachments to that.
I mean, it's supposed to be enjoyable for anybody involved, and it's supposed to be consensual, whereas everybody's agreeing and is excited or desires to take part of it. Nobody, if one party or one person doesn't really necessarily desire for the sexual encounter to happen, then I mean, it's not going to be as enjoyable for anybody. It's going to be some kind of a horrible memory, and
Absolutely.
And whoever was not enjoying it, and even
trauma that lasts.
Traumatic, yeah. It's I mean, sex is not supposed to cause PTSD. There's a lot of things, and there's a lot of misconceptions about how sexual violence is categorized. There was a report that studied university students in the United Kingdom, and they found that among most of the students, there was kind of a spectrum of whether or not sexual violence was considered rape or not rape, whereas there was kind of a gray area of whether or not something was consensual or not. And that kind of plays into how if she was wearing, or if the victim was wearing something that she was asking for it, or if she wasn't. I mean, I say she, even though we all acknowledge that there are many different situations of sexual violence, and there is not a specific category of people who do not or do qualify as victims of sexual assault. But the majority oftentimes is young women or women in general that are victimized by men. So that being said, in this study, the majority of young men categorize different acts of assault as on a spectrum of whether or not, based off of social cues, or how much she wanted it, or how much, what she was wearing, how short her skirt was, So it's there's definitely some kind of misconceptions about, well, if she said yes to this one thing, then that means everything's okay. I think you had talked about how, if you say yes to initial consent, with the sexual script theory, right? Yeah.
So the affirmative consent model kind of sets up a situation where both parties or all parties are consistently checking in with each other, making sure everything's okay. It's an ongoing process that's reciprocal and includes input from both parties instead of just one. And that goes back to the sexual script theory, where it's kind of stated that the media and your environment, your families, your friends, kind of impact how you view a sexual situation should go. And that does tie into like the media with pornographic material. And basically it kind of sets up this situation where men are the pursuers and women are kind of seen as like these gatekeepers.
And that is so prominent in like especially like movies and TV shows.
So very much so,
like in books
in the media, books, and like every place that we see heterosexual relationships is kind of put on the men to be the sexual aggressors.
They're like pursuing, they have to earn the women's like so, and I think that what you're saying, like it leads into like, well, if she says no, like you just have to fight for more, you know,
try
like
again, just keep pushing.
Women are something that you were supposed to win. If you can hit that, then you've won something. But it really like dehumanizes what a woman actually is.
It's like a sexual conquest. It's not like there's a relationship that's being, you know, cultured or some kind of deep, meaningful connection. It's more of like, well, you know, I won. I got to have sex with her, so therefore I'm like the champion here. You know, it's not
men
like
definitely use sex as a social status too.
I mean, not exclusively, but I think generally in society, it's like, well, you know, if you haven't like men that like manly men are like, they, you know, masculinity can sometimes be defined as like how much sex you have or how good of a player you are, or you know how many, you know, women you get. You know, it's not like actual characteristics of your personality or any type of, you know, other non-sexual, you know, wins or successes.
The model also focuses on kind of moving away from the no means no or like yes means yes model and kind of focusing towards an ongoing conversation. So that all parties have a chance to like keep consenting
and checking in with each other.
Most men will just get that initial consent and then think
just
that
roll
that
with
means
it.
that yes to one thing is yes to everything, but
which
that's not necessarily true.
There are like, not to go into too graphic detail, but there are multiple levels of. I mean, everybody's heard of first base, second base, third base, you know, home run or whatever, and there are multiple levels of whether or not the parties have consented to every level. If you consent to first base, doesn't mean that you want to go all the way, you know. And there's different aspects of even going all the way. So it's like it often gets misconstrued if initially if you want to make out in the back seat and then that turns into something that you don't want. But since you said yes originally, you know, it's just like.
Some people feel backed into a corner.
And they feel pressured.
They have to follow up.
They want to like. They don't want to make the other person like not feel satisfied or like
hurt their
out of
feelings.
guilt.
Or like get kind of bad reputation about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Consent is so much broader and more nuanced than just a question and an answer. Because you can say yes, but also there's the factor of, do you feel safe? What if you say if you deny it? Is something bad going to happen to you? Is the situation going to escalate? So a lot of people will fawn,
like,
they
especially
will
in terms
fall back.
of violence,
and they'll say yes, but it doesn't actually mean that they're consenting to what's being done to them. They're just protecting themselves in case something violent will.
It's protection.
Yeah,
it's preemptive protection.
I think that's a really interesting point to also talk about. Also, again, like the justice system and reporting of sexual violence. Because, you know, a lot of people feel like, especially, it's a hard thing to talk about in general, and it's very hard for a lot of victims and survivors to report that. And definitely when you have cases where they have even at one point said yes, they're much more likely to not report it.
I read an article about that, about how, you know, if they feel like, especially if the victims feel like at any point they had, you know, it had been somewhat consensual, whether that be a very initial encounter of maybe I'm attracted to this person, but I don't want to have sex with them, or maybe when they kissed me or I kissed them, I wanted to just keep kissing them, but then it kind of spiraled into something more that they didn't want to happen. And those individuals, those people that experience the non-consensual encounter, they are more than 15 times less likely to report any type of assault, because they feel like we come up in a culture of, well, if, you know, you wanted it even a little bit, then it was deserved, or, you know, it wasn't, you know, assault or rape. So
I think that plays into like exploitation, and that
people
consent
take advantage
is not
of it.
given
Yeah,
under duress.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
if you feel like you have no choice, and that's not really consent.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And I think it really also plays into the rape culture that is kind of prevalent. That
especially in terms of like pornography, like
pornography and the justice system.
Yeah.
Sometimes women are not believed, or their appearance or their social status or their race will even kind of deter someone from believing them.
Yeah, like especially women of color or anybody with like a queer background, like that tends to eliminate them from you know, social innocence. You know, it's like just because a person looks a certain way or has a certain identity, it makes them less likely to be believed. And especially women get that reputation because of just, you know, decades, centuries of
people really have a certain picture in their head of who is a victim and who is not a victim, and what a perpetrator looks like, and someone that can't be a perpetrator. And I feel like kind of off topic, but this is a lot of reasons why sometimes in consensual or non-consensual situations, women are not believed to be the perpetrators, even though in some cases they are, because
it goes both ways.
Culture.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It goes both ways. I definitely agree with that. I think, you know, especially between like queer communities and I mean, it's not just one way or the other. I think like it's definitely not something that can be taken lightly for between interactions of any gender or identification or you know, sexual identity. I think it's definitely important to note that this exists in all spheres of human sexuality.
Absolutely. And I definitely wanted to touch kind of on those more like minority cases. I do remember reading that only about 13% of reported sexual abuse crimes are men, 13% of them. So it's like we have, you know, that makes them a minority in that field, because men are much less likely to report.
Right.
And also just we were talking about how it shouldn't be under duress. Most survivors know their the perpetrator. And that's definitely, you know, people have an idea of, oh, this is rape, this is not, and this is, it's
like
much
younger
more
kids,
nuanced.
stranger danger.
Absolutely.
But
And it was much more recently, you know, rape was a crime, but marital rape being a crime was much more recent.
And there's some kind of idea that just because if they're married, then nothing can be rape, you know, like it's already consensual.
The marriage is the automatic
That's
consent.
the automatic consent. I think another thing is like the power dynamic. Like we had talked earlier about how a lot of people like in power, like especially in terms of like grooming, there's you know, even right now there's a huge scandal in the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is paying $12 million or something in reparations to over, I think it was over 300 or 400 victims of sexual violence in the Catholic Church. And it just there's like a power dynamic of this older, responsible, in charge individual has taken care of, you know, a minor, or even just like an of age but less powerful individual. I think power dynamics play into a lot of non-consensual sexual encounters, because if somebody feels like they don't have the power to say no, or they don't have the power to resist, then that leaves them more vulnerable to being sexually abused or taken advantage of.
This starts at a very young age too, because as we were saying earlier, even as a kid, you were told by adults, go hug your grandma,
and
your
if you're never exposed to any type of education,
can't say no, exactly, you were raised with like people instilling into you that you should always be obedient to the adults, to older people. So that's why a lot of young children get groomed, because they think that this is what I was meant to do, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what is expected of me.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And that carries into your adulthood.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean, it starts with the roots every time. I mean, it's something that we all feel like needs to be mandated in if not public schools, then at least some kind of community training. I mean, for only 22 out of 50 states to be mandating, sex ed at all. And then in those 22 states, the requirements are very loose and they're very vague. And we feel like there is an absence in education for young children, teens, and especially on college campuses with the amount of statistics and research that has been done in terms of sexual assault and rape instances, especially in like party culture or more traditional forms of college relationships. I think this is a really important topic, and we invite anybody that is interested in the topic to do research. We're going to link a lot of the research that we have found in terms of finding facts in terms of this discussion. Anybody have any other things to say or add about the importance of consent in our day-to-day interactions in culture?
Another misconception that really gets under my skin is that people think that a bodily reaction qualifies as
physical
consent.
I definitely agree. I feel like just because there's a physical reaction, that might just be a self-preservation measure to prevent injury.
It's a biological response for a lot of people too.
Yeah, definitely.
It's not necessarily, sometimes your brain doesn't even recognize what is happening yet.
It's just, it's not even,
it's like a reflex. It's not cognitive. You're not doing it on purpose. It's involuntary.
I definitely just also wanted to make sure that it was just like said of just verbal consent and like knowing what that dialogue can sound like. It can
to make it less awkward.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be awkward.
Like, do you consent? Check this box here.
That's so formal.
So medical.
Is this okay?
Yeah.
Can I do this? Can I kiss
just
you?
checking in?
Exactly.
Like you were talking about, Shay, you were talking about how like if both parties are consistently talking and communicating, that makes it a much better experience for everybody.
And it really does.
It doesn't have to be awkward.
It doesn't have to be awkward, and it really goes back to we already said how consent makes it more satisfying, but just open dialogue, open conversation in general was one of the things.
It's more fulfilling.
Yes.
Made for most
good
people have
sex.
reported. Yeah. I mean, definitely there's a lot of problems with how consent is viewed and taught in our society, and I mean it differs by culture and region, definitely in my country and part of the world. But I think point blank, both parties have to be consistently on board and agreeing with all degrees of whatever is happening sexually, and I think it's something that is so we're deprived of in our society, because obviously there's a huge problem with sexual violence, especially even in relationships like we were talking about, married couples. But it is not something to be taken lightly. Like there's definitely a deficit of information. I feel like if there were better resources even from the government to educate young people in the country. But even just in college campuses. But we invite you guys to look at the resources that we've attached, and we're definitely able and willing to answer any questions or concerns about different topics that we've addressed. We know this is a really sensitive topic, so any type of really specific questions towards this, different. There's a lot of bad stuff to talk about with this topic, but we invite an open and educational dialogue. If there's any type of hate speech or any type of problematic speaking, then that will not be tolerated. But we really just promote healthy sexual encounters and healthy sex lives for everybody. I mean, it's not something that should be so hush-hush about. So
it should become normalized.
Normalized.
The more you talk about it, the more familiar you are with it, the less taboo it is.
I love the phrase "consent is sexy."
Consent is so sexy.
It's
the sexiest thing that can happen.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, we enjoyed talking about this topic. We hope that you guys enjoyed learning about different aspects of something that is honestly not covered enough in our society. So, all right, thank you guys. Bye.
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 I feel like that was good.
Yeah.
How long was
Yeah,
that?
we kind of ate that.
That was like
29